Welcome back to Navigating Complexity. Today, we're thrilled to continue our exploration of how people navigate life's most challenging systems and situations, and there's no better way than to welcome back a previous guest, Rick Archer. Rick is an architect and visionary whose work goes far beyond creating buildings. It's about transforming lives and communities. In this convo, hosts Matt and Dan explore Rick's extraordinary projects, like redesigning the US-Mexico border as a place of connection, healing, and opportunity, and addressing homelessness and child abuse through innovative, human-centered design. We'll explore how creativity, collaboration, and a willingness to embrace the unknown can lead to groundbreaking solutions for today's most pressing issues. From cleaning up polluted rivers, restoring dignity to underserved communities, to using technology in new and meaningful ways, Rick's approach challenges us to think bigger and bolder about the problems we face. So let's jump in and see how Rick navigates complexity with purpose and vision.
Welcome back to Navigating Complexity.
Matt.
Welcome back to having us.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's nice. So when we first, this on our first episode, part one of Rick Archer was, backstory and some of the things of how you've got to where you are now. And today is more about a conversation about what's going on today, the things that are complex today, some of the things that you are facing today. We talked about AI. We talked about some of the other projects that are really important, border and things of that nature. I'd love to dive into that. Yeah. But also anything else that you've faced in your journey that's complex in nature that you've had to navigate and be really thoughtful and mindful about, I think is a great just time for us to connect and chat about that. So awesome. I'd like to start with, what we first started talking about, which was AI. What question did you have around AI?
Well, I just finished reading that book Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari, which is his newest book about AI. And what sort of struck me when I was reading it is that he used almost all of his analogies were old informational technology or the Bible and religion as a technology to transmit information. And one of the things that he said that I thought was sort of the core argument of the book was more information doesn't actually get you closer to the truth, right? It has the ability to create these sort of bubbles, right, where the bubbles don't intersect, and there's lots of different permutations of that, right? But he called it and academics call it an intersubjective reality, right, where everybody buys into the same worldview and it's self-reinforcing, and I think you see that in politics. I think you see that in various institutions, and so it just sort of got me thinking about how we have this technology that I think in both of our day jobs is kind of staring us in the face. And if you think it's a more powerful technology than what we saw in the Industrial Revolution, right, it's going to be disruptive, right? And there's going to be winners and losers, and I think there's already some evidence of that. But anyway, I've been thinking about that topic a lot and sort of grappling with it on all those levels, right? Like the philosophical implications, what does it mean to be human? And so I was just curious, I know you're confronting that a lot in the design world. Just curious how you're sort of navigating some of these things too.
Well, it's interesting. Last night, a friend of mine from New Zealand sent me a little video, and it was a chart of how we spend our time. And it started back in, I think, 1924, and it went up to 2024. And it kind of in as the years passed, it sort of shifted the graph.
Oh, interesting.
It was pretty fascinating. So in some ways, not surprisingly, in 1924, the majority of our time, or the plurality of our time, was spent with family and then with friends. And then, you could kind of follow what I would think are traditional mores about how we think about what we value. And of course, being online or engaging with technology was a zero.
Right.
And, over time, you saw the technology piece begin to grow a little bit, and then all of a sudden it begins to leapfrog all the other ways we spend time, until today it represents like 70% of our time.
Wow.
And so, you're like from 0 to, and I may be exaggerating, may have been 60, but it was a huge shift.
Sure, yeah.
Where you're going, wow. So we are displacing human interaction, family, friends, coworkers, faith, all the things that occupied our time are now occupied in other ways. And that may be the bigger change than any of it. And with AI, is that going to go further, which I suspect it will, right? Because we become more and more engaged in and quite honestly dependent on technology. And so,
well, it's the full circle. AI becomes your family again.
Well, and I mean, I did have to look at it with a little bit of, take it with a grain of salt, because some of what we're doing on technology is actually relating to those people, but relating in new ways. But I think the point was whether we're face-to-face with human interaction or we're, face-to-face with a screen of some kind, which is more and more how we spend our time. Is it possible that AI could actually disrupt that and get us less in front of a screen because it's doing things, interacting in ways that we don't see yet? I mean, that'd be fascinating to think about. I'd love to see it work in service of humanity rather than against, being fully human. But
well, as I think you both know, we're working on an AI project with our company, Founding Up, and what we've noticed, or what kind of just the awareness and the conversations, part of it is that we have been in information technology or information age for 30 plus years. And everything that you've described is us just so much like content and data and technology. And so having AI do the heavy lifting with that allows us then to.
Well, that would be the hope, right?
Yeah.
And I think, as an architect, I would say there's two ways that our industry is looking at this. One of them is a fear mentality, which is it's going to take away our jobs.
Right.
Sure.
And the other one is optimism, hope. It's going to liberate us to be able to do the more creative things that we ought to be doing anyway.
Yeah.
And they're probably both true.
I was just going to say they're both right.
Depending on how you approach what you do. And we've always been, I would say, early adopters of technology. I wouldn't say that Overland has been on the cutting edge, the bleeding edge, but we've been right behind it because we've believed that technology could help us do what we do better. And not only to utilize it in service to the project, like when we started using AutoCAD and Revit and other things, AutoCAD was a drafting tool that worked like a pencil. We just were doing it on the computer. Once we went into building information, BIM technology, now we were embedding things into the drawings that hadn't been there before. This was a brand new thing. And we could either continue to use it as a drafting tool, which I would say many did, or we could say, okay, well, how does that fundamentally shape how we design, how we think? We have a brand new tool. And so I think we were early on saying, no, it actually shapes the buildings in new ways, and we can learn things from it that will make our buildings better, perform better, hopefully be more beautiful and more humane. Now, as we're into AI, it's kind of taking that next step further. We began, certainly well over a decade ago, utilizing computer technology to test ideas. And it was a form of artificial intelligence. It wasn't called that,
right.
But we'd create a script that would say, hey, if we're going to have skylights in this space and we want those skylights to deliver this many foot candles at this distance above the ground, we want the color temperature to be this, blah, blah, blah. We could put all that in. And then literally the computer would spit out an infinite number of solutions to that problem. And then we would then study those and say which of these best accomplish what we're trying to do.
Right.
And Today, we wouldn't call that artificial intelligence, but that's effectively what we were using the computer to do, is to think for us in new ways.
Yeah, it's like brute force computation. That,
yeah.
I always thought, because the equivalent is a yield study, right, for a developer, where you look at a piece of property and you think, what could be there, right? And you could now put in inputs, right, and get a response that tells you how many parking spots it needs to be, and then you can sort of back into the economics of it. But it's wild how much time that brute force computation saves you, and how many ideas you run across that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of, right? Just because you don't have the unlimited computing power that your machine does.
Yeah.
We're working currently with Icon, the 3D printing company here in Austin, who I'm sure you guys know well. And Jason Ballard is a dear friend, and we were working on a design for his church. And between the master plan and the beginning of schematic design, they innovated a new technology that allows them to print 27 feet tall with Phoenix. Rather than Vulcan, we were limited to 12 feet. And as soon as Phoenix came out, I called him up and I said, let's print your church. Yeah. It's like, we can now do that. We couldn't do that, last week, but this week we can. And so we've
printing the church. That's just a new term.
and it'll, I think, be the first one in the world. Yeah. But it opens up all kinds of opportunities. And we as designers now, we're going, we don't know how to interface with that.
Have you ever designed a 17-foot tall space before? Like, it seems like a new dimension, right?
Well, it's 27 feet tall.
Or 27.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. For sure. But churches throughout history have been taller than that.
Right.
But now we have a medium that allows us to have a kind of plasticity of form that we haven't seen since, say, the Baroque era, where people were carving it out of stone and doing impossible things at great expense. Now we can do it inexpensively. The computer doesn't care. And so what does that open up in terms of formal opportunity? Not just, hey, we can make this, but we can mean this as we make it in new ways. And how does this tie into that long trajectory of church form since the beginning of the church? And so one of the things that we did for the client is we said, we're going to test this in AI. We're going to take your church as it's formed in terms of the scale of the church, the number of pews, the et cetera, the liturgy. And we are going to wrap a building around it using AI just to show you how it could respond to being 3D printed and to being connected to a Byzantine, a Gothic, or a contemporary idiom. And literally, in a matter of days, we had spit out these pretty extraordinary things, none of which were what we're going to end up doing. It was an experiment with a very willing client to say, we all have to limber up. We have to think differently if we're going to 3D print this. And so doing it the way we've done it in the past isn't going to help us get there.
It's amazing. So what is an example of making it be what you mean, or have the building be an expression of what you mean?
Well, I think if you look at the long history of church architecture throughout history up until really the modern era, well, actually, in some ways you could say back at the Reformation, things changed. But certainly until the modern era, there was a way that people read buildings that meant something to them. And this was true not just in churches, it was probably true in every form of building that we did. A university had buildings that meant something when you went there, and you knew how to read them. We were all literate in reading the world around us. Today, we are virtually illiterate in reading the world around us. And so using this new technology, we are able to now go back and reference that long and ancient history of the way things have been done, and there was a reason why they were done that way, but to do it in a way that is completely new and of this time. So it's a really fun kind of ancient future approach to doing design.
That's wild.
How do you tackle there's some fear or controversy around AI running a shop the way you do, and people that you've got to kind of encourage how do you tackle that? How do you embrace it versus fear it?
Well, I think for us, we've always embraced technology, and so we come into it with that perspective. Secondly, we are always trying to have original thought. We're not trying to do what's been done before. That's the danger of AI, right? Because it's actually drawing from the past and then bringing it to the future.
Which is the source of a lot of its biases and a lot of problems. You train it on data and it finds a pattern like, hey, I ought to, on average, discriminate against this kind of person in my decision making, right?
Yeah, or look at the writing that comes out of it. You're like, oh, that was AI.
Yeah,
it has absolutely no soul. There's no poetry to it. And so, as artists, I'm not threatened by it because it can't do what we do. But I mean, I use spell check and I use, Grammarly and things like that are a form of AI to look at my work and make sure that I'm, consistent with the English language. And that's helpful. Yeah. I'm not going to ask it to write my paper. I'm not going to ask it to design my building, but I'm going to use it for what it has the capability of doing. And I think everybody in our shop understands that. And I think we're all exploring it at different levels. I mean, it depends on the person and their comfort with technology, and but we are exploring. We're in the mix.
Interesting. That's really cool. Love that. And yes, it's AI is as you pointed out, it's not creative. It doesn't have that artist mentality. It's information that goes and gets it. It's good for ideas and good for spell check and good for that, but
there's a architecture software called TestFit, which I'm sure you're
wonderful.
Yeah, it's great. And it's not really AI, but it kind of is moving in that direction. And it has architects scared to death.
Yeah.
What does it do?
It'll take a site and then lay out the most efficient way to park it, the most efficient way to put apartments on it. It's increasingly moving into urban design tools. And I think it's a really powerful tool. But it's not going to replace me or the people that work with me. Yeah. But dang, there are a lot of architects who think it's the devil incarnate because it's going to steal what we're doing. It's not. In fact, I think its whole intention is to create a world where we can solve the mundane more easily and then focus on making a more resilient, more beautiful world.
Yeah, and I think that's the point of anytime there's progress and change in technology, it's always going to change. I mean, when the internet came out, it changed everything. I mean, fax machines are no longer a thing. It's just one of those things that we used to do business a certain way. We do it different now, and, when the calculator, like, I remember, teachers being kind of like, you can't use a calculator. It's like, and now it's like, that's part of it. It just helps you get more complex in the things that you're doing. And so I think the same thing here, we just have to kind of get comfortable. But it is this human nature to kind of like stay, with what's comfortable. And so this is kind of an uncomfortable kind of thing. And so there's possibilities still there. So that's really cool. It's nice that there is that embrace, being able to embrace it. Because I think, to an artist, it's just going to, and to many individuals, many industries, it's just going to enhance the ability for you to get to another level versus, sure, there'll be some that'll be replaced. But I think that also those that embrace the tech early on or early adopters end up being the ones that can grow the fastest. And it won't replace them. It'll just enhance them. So,
I mean, there will definitely be abuse of it. Right. As there is, with writing papers and music, and there's going to be the making of buildings using AI, and then it's going to repeat itself over and over. And we could end up in this very banal world where everything is sort of moving this, whatever that trajectory happens to be. But I think there are always going to be people who push against that.
One of the things that you made me think about is something that we do have, and this will lead us to another topic that I want to discuss, what we talked about a little earlier around the border. For years, our education system. They fight for how to build books, and I know Texas is a big state for I think Texas, California are two of the bigger states that create our textbooks for the country, and so on and so forth. And it's been such a important thing, right? And for many years, and now, without intent, AI and who's ever creating AI is pumping in the ideals and then language, and it's it's a subtle thing because you think it's just the internet. But as you've noticed, the language AI, and so if a company or a person behind it has certain leanings one way or another, whether it be politics or whatever ideas, and they can add to it, then it just ever so subtle starts changing the people that are using it. And so it starts impacting the education without even intentionally saying these are the textbooks.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I think I would love us to get to the point where we had AI within our own shop, right? Mm-hmm. So it was only actually drawing from the things that we had created, and it created a database that we could actually draw from. It's not there yet. It's all open source. Mm-hmm. We used it recently on a public engagement process where we had 50 stakeholders, mm-hmm. and we gave them a multi-page essay answer survey, very complex. And then we just plugged all of their answers into AI, and it synthesized them into here is the general feeling about that question. Mm-hmm. It was actually really good at that. Then the person who was facilitating it then created a mission statement using AI, vision statement for the project. It was awful. Mm-hmm. And a series of guiding principles that were just, they were pablum. They were just terrible. Mm-hmm. And we actually ended up having almost this conflict between within the client/design group about how to move forward, because certain people said, well, let's just keep putting new input into AI and see what it'll give us. And then a group of us finally said, basically, screw that. We're going off over here. We're going to write it. Mm-hmm. And we then wrote it kind of as a committee. It was equally as bad, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. And when it was presented back to the stakeholders, it was sort of like, that was ho-hum. Mm-hmm. And then one other, Elizabeth Farso, a woman that we work with a lot on this kind of thing, and I sort of went off to the side during the meeting, and within about 10 minutes rewrote everything, brought it back to the group and said, what about this? And we got like a standing ovation.
Nice.
Because at some point, AI is a little bit like groupthink. Right. You don't create that way.
Right.
You can gather information that way beautifully, and it was amazing for that. But
yeah, it's another voice, right, or another perspective when you're in that kind of ethnographic research phase, right? But it's not an answer bot.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
There was a study that we looked at recently where it talked about forecasting and the ability to forecast of a human. And I'm going to screw the numbers up, but essentially it was, let's call it less than 100. And so a human on their own, be able to forecast is not great. AI on their own, be able to forecast, not great. Combined, it's like 130%. So it's like it's this like energy together. So to be able to take and pull from the whole internet and say, here's the ideas, and you're like, well, let me take that and let me massage it and go off to the side and come up with something that boom is much more, and that was for forecasting. So
it'd be fun to listen to this a year from now or 2 years from now and go, man, we had it so wrong.
I know. I keep wanting to say yet. It hasn't happened yet. But I mean, I think that's kind of the most interesting part, right? Is it just, if you look at the pace, right? Yep. Even just in the last, 5 to 8 years, right? I mean, it's accelerating at an accelerating rate, and I don't think that human minds have a very good ability, to your point, to be able to forecast what that looks like or what that means, and that's sort of the idea that I like. That's like when we talk about navigating complexity, like I think that's the hard part about it, is that you are navigating something that's inherently unknowable, right? And so how the heck do you do that? Or how do you steel yourself to be able to do it well?
I had a great aunt who was born in 1899 and she died in 2001. So she lived in 3 centuries. And it was fascinating because pretty much the entire Industrial Revolution happened in her lifetime. And to watch her try to keep up with what was, from being in a horse and buggy to a car to an airplane to, calculators to computers to, and it was just mind-boggling for her when you think about where she came from. But we're in an era that's far faster than that.
Right.
That if I live to be 101, I'm going to look back on
like flying cars and flying like Mars.
Who knows, right? Literally. And so it's pretty fascinating to think how our lives will change as a result of that.
You mentioned Jason Ballard and you were telling the story. My girlfriend's grandmother was 90 something or other. And when Jason first did that first printed house, we had him on a podcast. We had him in a magazine. And so she read the article and she was just blown away by the possibility of printing a house. And so I called in a favor. I said, Jason, can we go do a tour? And he's like, of course, yes, let's do it. And so that was the last outing she had. And she was just like, it was so heartfelt to see her in that house and just touching the things and just like, just to think, someone that had been and experienced all kinds of things, had no idea how this came about. She read it, she just could not comprehend it. And then
was this House Zero that you went to, or is it
the first house?
Yeah, the one that Lake Plato did over in West Austin.
Yes,
East Austin.
East Austin. Yeah. It was
a beautiful home.
And
I think they did a great job of showing that you could use the technology and really make something beautiful.
But your story made me reminded me of that. It's like, the kind of development that went over your lifetime and what we'll be able to see, as things progress and as fast as they do is really, really cool. I want to jump into taking this another directions because life is complex in many ways, and some of the things AI is a big one. But another thing is like working within systems, working within. We recently went through the election system, and there's a big divide in the country of how one sees and information and all that kind of stuff. Some of the projects that you're involved with and you've been involved with obviously have to deal with things that have to deal with government and ideals. So how do you? We started talking about one. We certainly elaborate on that if you'd like. But how do you navigate through some of that?
Yeah, We've been, well, first of all, this last election, I was actually surprised at how non-disruptive the election actually turned out to be because the two before had been obviously very challenging for America. And I think that was actually heartening, whether you like the outcome or not.
Right.
We have a country where we can transfer power theoretically peacefully, and I think we're doing a better job this time around, which is good. Because we are interested in what I would call the intractable problems, whether that's poverty, education, immigration, abuse, we end up getting involved with projects that address those. And our fundamental belief is that we can create physical transformations that will lead to human ones. So that we're not doing these because we want buildings. We're doing them because we're trying to accomplish something beyond the building. And we've designed the largest homeless center in the world, working on a larger one right now that'll actually be twice the size of Haven for Hope in San Antonio, working on one in Las Vegas that'll be twice that size. And seeing communities really say we need to address this issue, that being unhoused is not acceptable. We as a community need to do something about it. Austin has a notorious problem and has done a very poor job. And I've been pretty vocal about that here. Austin's problems are mostly political. So when you talk about the intractable problems, oftentimes it's because the political environment keeps us from being able to do what we ought to be able to do. San Antonio said, no, we're actually going to work together. We're going to address this. Has it solved the problem? No. But we've made great progress. And some of that progress is made through design. It's by sitting with a person on the street and saying, what do you need? How can we help you move from here to where you may want to go? Where do you want to go? That what we discovered was the thing that kept people where there was no vision for their future.
Right.
And the first thing that we need to do is cultivate vision, because without a vision, people perish. And so you have people on the street who have no vision for their life, and it might be something as simple as, I hope that someday my granddaughter would be able to sit in my lap in a room that I actually own or rent. That vision could be enough to get that person off the street and moving toward independence. And then we wrap a place around that helps them do that in a way that feels safe, non-threatening. We did the same thing with Child Safe, which is Center for Abused Children. Bexar County, where I live, has the worst problem with abuse in the state of Texas, probably among the worst in the country. And you're looking at one out of every 4 girls being molested before the age of 18, and 1 out of every 6 or 8 boys. And for 70 or 80% of those, that's sexual molestation. So you've got kids that are growing up with this horrible situation.
Right.
How do we begin to address that? And what was happening in San Antonio before is they were being shuttled around the city from the medical facility to the psychological facility to the police department so they could be questioned. They were having to bring the perpetrators to the police. And I mean, it was a horrible experience for these kids and their families. So Child Safe had this idea that we're going to co-locate all that and so that the perpetrators and the kids come to the same location, which is a bit of a scary thought. But doing it in such a way that they never interface made it easier for the kids to be able to go to one place, to get all their needs met, and then to connect them to nature. So much so that Fast Company magazine said that Child Safe was the most innovative healthcare project in the world in 2020. And it wasn't designed as a healthcare project. It was designed as a place to care for kids. And so I think we keep addressing these kinds of problems by saying we think design doesn't solve the problem, but design can create the platform to begin to address the problem. And so we really try to engage in those kinds of projects. And that goes back to the earlier question about meaning. How do we actually build meaning into these so it means something for the people who are working there and for the families, and so that they don't see themselves as victims or projects, but really as humans who are worthy of the dignity and the love that they receive.
It's so interesting that, we were just talking about like, how do you operate when you don't know what to do? And I think you just kind of answered that question, which is you need to have some sort of positive vision, right? Or some destination, and then a platform from which to be effective, right? And if you don't have those two things in those couple of examples, or if you don't have one of them, right, it's very hard to achieve it. And I can't think of anything more complex or difficult than being unhoused, right? And so it's like, well, if the thing you uncovered is just having that vision for where to go, allows you to make sense of all the different factors and forces and problems and things that are buffeting you.
At least to give you a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
That there could be a different future.
Yeah.
And you have to have hope. And oftentimes I think the world, it feels more and more hopeless to people. how would I ever get out of this? Right. I think I may have mentioned this before, but I was teaching a second grade class on architecture one time, and I asked them, what is the definition of creativity? And to this day, and this was back when I was in college, so this is over 40 years ago, this kid said, I know, Mr. Archer, creativity is what you do when you don't know what to do. Which is exactly what you just said. That's what
we were just saying, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is the definition of creativity. Yeah. And if we would think about creativity almost that simply, then we shouldn't be daunted by the problems that we don't know how to address. All it's doing is saying, hey, this is going to require some creativity, which is different than innovation. Innovation can be more crowdsourced. Creativity actually can't. It almost always comes from a single mind and then draws people into it. I think you can use a lot of innovation to get there, but creativity means thinking completely outside of the box you've been given. AI can't do that. The human mind is capable of doing that.
So how if somebody feels stuck, right? Like they can't just say, be creative, right? How do they break through that?
Well, I'll tell you what I do, because I think every day, any artist, architect, writer has to face the same thing, the blank page. Right? What do I do when I don't know what to do here? And I think it starts by just cultivating some disciplines. One of the things that I do is I write. I don't write to publish. I don't write for any other purpose than to get what's inside my head onto a sheet of paper. And that actually unlocks other creativity.
Yeah.
Because I've invited my brain to say, it's okay to just spill something out if it doesn't make sense, if it doesn't fix a problem, if it doesn't do anything. And then you continue that into every aspect of what you're doing. And so I think it's finding what it is for you that unlocks your ability to say, it's okay for me to have that thought.
I always say, write a really shitty first draft.
Yeah.
That just gets me moving. And then it becomes clear. But until I do that, I can't actually take that next step.
Well, what I find fascinating about writing, because do the same thing, is sometimes you'll write something and you put it away. And 6 months down the road, you're writing something else. And it triggers that memory, and then they go together like a piece of a puzzle. You're like, oh, that's what I started back then. I couldn't see it then.
Yeah.
It just takes you get into that next level.
My daughter, Whitney Fordham, is a writer, and she's a beautiful writer. It has a little thing she calls writing well. And she wrote the other day about how she had written something a year ago, and now what she had written a year ago was now speaking to her. Mm-hmm. She's like, I was actually speaking into the future, the words that I would need to hear at that moment, but didn't know that I would need them.
Yeah.
And I think that's and that's really what you were getting at. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you get it out there and then you go back and you go, yes, that's what I need right now. Mm-hmm. And I think drawing is the same way. Mm-hmm. Any way that we can, express what's going on inside. And oftentimes, one of the things I love about sketching is that you can almost suspend that sense of I have to even think or know. I just start doing. And in that doing, you begin to discover things that are going on that you weren't aware of.
What I love about what you said about the blank page applied to so many things. Because what you're thinking outside the box, the page is the box, you're really kind of stepping back and saying, if I didn't have these limitations, what could I create? And creation and the blank page is amazing. It makes me think of some of the things that we were discussing before around, at times people can get, or all of us can get, go down a rabbit hole of a certain thought or line process. And we saw some of this in the political landscape, and you get to where it's like divisive versus, and some of those projects you just have to kind of figure out. But my thought is, everyone starts with a blank page, and it's like, what are the issues? And just kind of seeing it from all angles and trying to create maybe things aren't the way they're supposed to be over here, but something, right. Create something that's that hasn't come into existence yet. And so,
I think a lot of time that starts with listening, both to the voice inside, but also to the world outside, where you don't come in with preconceptions.
Right.
I think curiosity is absolutely key. And then if you combine those two, you ask good questions, and then those questions begin to reveal things that you didn't know were there. And, I was thinking, actually, you talked about that of the border and the project that we're doing on the border. And we were engaged by the city of Laredo, but really by a community in Laredo and Nuevo Laredo to imagine a different future for the border. And that community at one point was a nation, which very few people know, that it was called the Republic of the Rio Grande, and it was defined by the two cities. And in, I believe it was 1848, in the Treaty of Guadalupe, the nation was divided in half, and half given to the United States and half given to Mexico.
Oh, wow.
And so they've always identified themselves as one people. And then, you fast forward to what's happened through time. I mean, as the two communities grew, they had an interconnected economy, and there was a real sense of familial relationship. I mean, probably you guys are even old enough to have gone down there, gone back and forth across the border. You just felt like it was definitely one community. That began to change during the Clinton administration and the war on drugs, and we began to harden the border and say, well, we've got to keep drugs out, so therefore. And it's continued pretty much in every successive administration, to the point where we have a border that's dying. It is necrotic. You've got a river which is filthy. You've got shops boarded up on both sides. Communities have turned their backs on the river, and the community in Laredo and Nuevo Laredo still have this DNA of, but we're one people. And so they began meeting together on a weekly basis, people from both nations, saying, what can we do? How do we change this? Could we imagine a different future for our border? And they expressed that interest to Ambassador Ken Salazar, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. And he was really captivated by, this grassroots movement. And he said, I'll be back next year, present a vision. That's when we came in. They hired us to help them, cast a vision for what we would do on the border that would reconnect the two nations. And that problem has become even more prescient, as we've seen the immigration crisis and became maybe the largest issue in this last election, certainly one of them. We have a shifting political environment around how we're going to handle the border. In my opinion, neither party has handled it well. I think they both actually handled it poorly. And so we have a real crisis. And the very first meeting we had with the community down there, this amazing activist, person who is really one of the visionaries behind this, Tricia Cortez, and I were meeting, and I asked her, I said, what is it that you hope to accomplish here? And, she talked about, the crisis on the border and really wanting to make a statement that this is not what we should be doing. And I'm not quite sure what possessed me to say this to her, but I said, Tricia, do you want to make a statement or do you want to make a difference? And she was like, well, what do you mean? I said, we can make a political statement. Obviously the politics is messed up on the border. But what is it you really want to accomplish? And she said, well, I think I want to do both. And I said, well, you don't get to do both. If you make a political statement, you're going to piss somebody off.
Right.
And whoever that somebody is somebody that we need to support this project. if you want to make a difference, what would that be? And she said, at the heart of this, we want to reconnect families and friends who've been separated from each other for decades. And I said, so that means a physical space where people could actually gather. And she's like, yeah, that's what we hope this will be. And the vision became a 1,000-acre conservation park, 500 acres in Mexico, 500 acres in the United States, 6.2 miles of the Rio Grande River. It required cleaning up the river. Mexico is dumping 15 million gallons of effluent into the river every day in Laredo. 6 million people are drinking that water.
Oh. Wow.
That's their sole source of drinking water. And I was like, that's like putting your straw in the toilet, literally. Yeah. And all the people are sick. They have horrible, water problems. So that's job one. We got to clean up the river. Mexico's been an amazing partner. They have jumped in and said, we're committed to that. They've already spent $18 million. They're going to spend probably another 70 before they're done, but they're getting it done. On the U.S. side, we have just destroyed the river by denuding the banks in order to clear them so that Border Patrol can see. I understand, their need to have visibility, but they've cut out all of the native species. And so the silt is just running off into the river. And in Laredo, I could walk across the river without the water coming to my knees. So they're making the problem worse in terms of patrolling the border. You've got an 18-inch deep cesspool that's heating up with the sun, which makes horrible water
growing
conditions.
Colonies.
Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely awful. It increases the flood risk because you no longer have, the deep water basin that's been there historically. And so this is about, okay, we have to solve the ecology. We need to deal with the border crisis. We can't just turn our backs and say, it's all okay. It's not. I mean, our friends in Mexico are saying, help. We're being overrun by the cartel. This is not a safe place. How do we shift the dynamic? Border Patrol on the U.S. side is saying, we want safe, legal crossing, but we don't have an ability to even do that well. And so how could we begin to address that? How could we reconnect the economies of these two places? How could we connect their cultural identity? And so our initial thought was, well, let's make the park available on both sides to everybody. And then we realized, well, we're going to have to build walls on both sides to create a corral around a 1,000-acre park. And that did not sound like a good outcome. Right. And so our team asked the question, what about the bridge? Could we create effectively a DMZ over the Rio Grande River where people from both nations could come, return to their nation, but never have to actually cross over, but they could mix? Yeah. Doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And when we posed that idea to the communities, and they said it'll never happen. And of course, the question is, well, why? Border Patrol will never let us. And, I think I said to them, one of my mentors once said, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. Yeah. Have you asked them? Well, no. I said, you don't know the answer. Let's get them here the next morning. And the next morning, 6 Border Patrol agents, including the chief of that sector, came. We sat with them and said, hey, this is what we want to do. We want to shift where you pay the toll so that if I'm in the U.S., I can enter the bridge without paying a toll. I don't pay till I get into Mexico. The other way around from Mexico, and have people be able to mingle on the bridge. And we're going to create kind of a high line like in New York City in the sky over the river. That'll be a park where people can gather. And they're like, we don't see a problem with that at all. And
they're probably relieved to have a solution.
They were, and that was interesting because we ended up talking to the chief of Border Patrol in Washington, D.C. and saying, hey, this is the plan. He said, yeah, I've heard about it from my people. I think it's a great idea. It will help me patrol the border. The creation of the park on both sides is going to make the visibility, the lateral movement, all the things I need. I'll be able to employ technology more effectively. And we can bring life back to the river and to the border, which is the single biggest thing that you need to create a safe environment, is people using it, eyes on it. And so he's like, I'm 100% supportive. And then Barbara Warren, a young architect in my office who's from Mexico, found the legislation that the Congress had passed for the border wall, and the legislation says must be used for steel bollard wall or environmental enhancements on the border, which will improve security. And so we asked the chief of Border Patrol point blank, will this improve security? He has said, absolutely. And $1 billion allocated for the Laredo sector, never been spent. He said, I would support that being, used for this park conservation project. Now, we got to get the Congress to go along. Right. And I think in the new administration, which is obviously going to take a more hardened approach to the border, I think the message is, yes, maybe good fences make good neighbors, but so do bridges. That we need to create a way that we connect if we're going to control. It can't just be stop. It has to be control and connect.
Right.
And so I'm hopeful that we're providing a middle way. Mm-hmm. It's not an either or, but.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of some of the dynamics it's not dissimilar from these other sort of bright lines politically, like between, say, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where you have these, kind of very different outcomes, right, on either side of a border.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of curious too, if you explored at all how, I'm increased economic prosperity, right? This market that has sort of been shut down for a couple decades. Like, is that sort of something that folks recognize as being maybe a good prevention of some of the problems that the people would normally associate with having a more open border?
Without a doubt. I mean, both of those cities have really suffered from the separation. Yeah. Nuevo Laredo, even more than Laredo, but both are very, very poor. What's fascinating about that particular place is that it has become the largest port in the United States, in North America. It's now larger than Los Angeles or New Orleans.
By
or New
volume
York, of
wow.
goods coming in and out. And without that crossing, our country just, our trade ends. And when we had the Chinese embargo in Los Angeles, that's where everything was coming in and out of this country from the West. So imagine trying to build a conservation project park in the middle of Los Angeles port.
Right.
That's what we're doing. But helping the trade routes, helping create that kind of interchange is really, really critical. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that what's coming across the border, the number one import from Mexico is drugs, and number two is humans. And the number one export from the United States into Mexico is arms. That's what we're mostly trading in. And that has to be stopped. And I think getting some controls on the border that allow us to monitor what comes in and out on those rail lines and trucks is absolutely critical. I personally think, and I've floated this idea in Laredo, I feel like if they could become more of a distribution hub rather than a pass-through, like they get no benefit from that economically, whereas Los Angeles, the economic benefit of that port is enormous.
Yeah, I mean, even El Paso is pretty accomplished at being a logistics hub as well.
But Laredo isn't.
Yeah.
And so also, I think by becoming a logistics hub, as things come off of the train or out of the truck to be distributed, you have a better window in what's inside there. So it could be both, helping solve major problems and create an economic activator for that community on both sides of the border. So I think we just have to think more creatively about, it's not just a problem, but there's an opportunity in that problem.
I love that, because that going back to the blank sheet and taking people's like current stance of the problem that they're seeing and saying, how do we see all the pieces of the puzzle, and how do we come up with this solution that is positive for everybody?
Yeah.
So it answers that question.
You may be familiar with the park. I think it's in Tijuana, where in the bollard wall they put a seesaw through the wall so the kid on either side. And that was kind of what they had in mind. We'll do something that'll tell people that we're still together. I actually find that a little offensive. I realize what it does is it points our attention to the fact this isn't a good solution. But let's actually try to come up with solutions.
Yeah, and that's what you mean by a political statement as opposed to a,
I got to say, I really love that statement versus a difference, because, and also what I'm getting from this conversation is think and address bigger. I think sometimes people are trying to solve one thing without taking into account all the dots that it connects. And so when you look at and it is the conversations, it is having the conversations like what you talked about earlier about having conversations with homeless individuals. What is it that you need? And listening, all part of the creative process to come up with a much grander solution than just the seesaw across the...
Yeah, and I think in our technologized, cultural, media-driven world, we have this tendency to think, well, if I just post about it, I've done something. And oftentimes, the posting about it is the opposite of doing something.
Right.
You actually are driving the division.
Mm-hmm.
When I was CEO at Overland many years ago, when we had the border crisis with kids in cages on the border, which you probably remember, just horrible. A young woman in my office who, wonderful activist, was always pushing me about, hey, what are we doing about? And often my response was, well, we're actually not doing anything about that because we're an architecture firm. And but she came to me about the kids in cages, and she said, what are we doing about that? And I said, well, what do you think we ought to do? And she said, we ought to be posting our social channels. And I said, okay, and what good do you think that would do? And she said, well, we just need to do something. I'm doing that. I said, I appreciate that. Last week, I was in a meeting in Washington, D.C. with the ambassador of Guatemala, which most of these kids were Guatemalan, U.S. senators and congressmen, and we got them together to talk about how might we really solve this problem. And that means investing in Guatemala so that there's not a reason for them
those
to
children
leave.
End up there. Yeah.
And so that started a binational cooperation around Guatemala, that Guatemala started doing some amazing things to care for their own, which they initiated. And the U.S. became more attentive. And we didn't have kids in cages from Guatemala. They were from other places. Yeah. But if I start posting about that,
right,
it's not going to happen.
Right.
Like, it's the death knell.
Yeah, nobody will work with you.
Yeah. And so I think that we have gotten lulled into this thinking that if we just, speak what we believe out into some huge vacuum, that it's going to make a difference in the world. And I just don't see that that's where it happens.
So what advice would you give that young woman then who maybe can't get into that room that you were able to put together and solve the problem, right? Like, I think that's been my observation is there's this sort of feeling of helplessness around these things. And when people are shouting into the void, or I think more often shouting into the echo chamber, and just reinforcing the beliefs of that community, that it's sort of from a place of helplessness. I don't know if it's a true observation.
No, I think it absolutely is true. And this is a wonderful human who really wants to help. I would say the first thing that I would say is, okay, look around you, at your friends, at your neighbors, your family, and what cages are they in that you actually can help, where you can actually make a difference. Because that's symptomatic of a much bigger view of the world that we have, that it's okay to somehow separate people, lock them up, do whatever. And I think that, a great example with her is that she was facilitating a conference on equity in the city, and as her mentor, I was kind of walking through that with her, and she brought a really wonderful speaker in for the event and had a great turnout, which I was a part of. And the event was horrible. And afterwards, I sat with her and I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "How do you think it went?" She said, "Well, it was okay." And I said, "Really, how'd you think it went?" She said, "It was terrible." And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, our main speaker just really didn't do a good job. He didn't set the table. It was just so far off that it threw off the entire thing." And I said, "Why'd that happen?" And she kind of looked at me. I said, "You were running the conference, right? What was your main job?" And she looked at me. She goes, "That was my job, wasn't it?" I said, "Yeah, that was your job. Why didn't you get your job done?" And she said, "I was setting out chairs and getting the food out and making sure." And I was like, "Why didn't you get other people to do that?" And she said, "Well, I had other people doing it, but I wanted to help them to show that there wasn't any work that was beneath them." And I said, "Okay, and how'd that go for you?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Not well." And I said, "It did two things. One, you didn't do your job because you were doing their job. And secondly, and this may be the worst thing, you communicated to them that their job wasn't important."
Which is not what she meant to do.
No, she meant to do the opposite.
Right.
But I said, when you say, I wanted them to know that it wasn't beneath me, you've already demeaned their work.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And she was just like, dang, I get it. I see it. I know what I did. And so, to me, those are the kind of interactions that we'll have. Let's actually deal with something you're doing,
Right.
Not something that you might not be able to do. And how are you perhaps not treating people with dignity inadvertently to an attitude that their work is not as important as yours? And I think it's that same mindset that leads us to putting kids in cages.
Right.
I know that sounds like a stretch, but
Right. No,
but I think it's getting ourselves oriented to what can I do and do well here.
well, I hear be the change you want to see, and actually do more than a post. Like, think creatively of what, who do I need to be talking to? How can I impact? And know that nothing's unreachable. It's one of those things that you've got to just have enough conversations. Conversations are gold because you want to understand what the larger problem is. And if you're in those rooms having those conversations, creative solutions will come out. If it's not you, it's others that in that process.
And what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
I knew the ambassador from Guatemala because my daughter, as a college student, got interested in malnutrition in Guatemala. She began studying a solution to it. We traveled to Guatemala together so she could begin to try to see it realized. We ended up meeting this gentleman, because of what she was doing, working with this hospital, he became fascinated with what she was doing, said, I want to roll this out for the whole country. He ends up becoming the ambassador of Guatemala. And I've got a friend.
Wow.
Because my daughter, who's in college, doing what she could do.
Right. It's so funny you mentioned your daughter, because so we were talking about summer camp for my daughter. She's going to go for the first time this year, and she wanted to go with a friend. And so I explained to her that, I think it's a superpower in life to be able to drop into a group of humans that you don't know, and you can be the person you want to be, right? You don't kind of come with any baggage, but you also have this like environment of pure possibility, right? And we were talking about that, and she was like, so okay, but I still want to go with my friend, and so she's going to go to summer camp with her friend, and it's all fine, but it was sort of like this kind of bias towards action, right? Like going to summer camp is better than that pure version that her dad was advocating for, right? Plus, like she's getting 90% of it, right? Yeah. And so it's like the wrong thing to do was to look for the perfect situation. The right thing to do was
do
something that you can control, right? And I don't know. I feel like that idea of like a bias towards action gets you to start figuring stuff out, even if the first step is kind of clumsy or in the wrong direction.
And this young woman is doing amazing things.
Of course,
today. I mean, as you would expect.
Love that. Well, thanks for being with us today. This has been some amazing complexities in how we navigate it. I think some really creative solutions.
Thank you, Dan.
That's right.
Yeah, great to be with you guys.
Yeah, this is great.
What an incredible conversation with Rick Archer. He addressed intractable problems with compassion and creativity, reimagining the role of architecture in solving societal challenges. Rick's insights have truly inspired us to think how design can be a catalyst for change. Creativity isn't just about making something. It's what we do when we don't know what to do. And whether it's designing a better future for the border, empowering communities, or simply navigating the complexities of life, his work shows us what's possible when we start with a vision and a blank page. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode. See you next time on Navigating Complexity.